Hi, I'm Declan Hamden. I work at the Centre for Physical Education, Sport and Activity at Kingston University. And this screencast is to give you a very condensed overview of our guidance that we've produced for you. And we'll also give you a typical session feedback following somebody's teaching. So the guidance is as follows, and the acronym review is on the left there. And you can see that process and purpose with some examples that you can pause this screencast at your leisure and read through. But we're going to try and give you a condensed typical session where I'm going to act as the mentor and my colleague Alex Becky will act as the student teacher. So thank you for allowing me to observe your lesson today, Alex. There was some great teaching going on there and some really effective learning by the pupils. So looking at your lesson plan, the focus of your lesson was to plan and teach well-structured lessons with a focus on imparting knowledge and develop understanding through effective use of lesson time. So could you tell me something that you were really pleased with from your lesson today? What was the most positive thing you took from your lesson?
Taking on the review of last time and the reflection I had a much clearer plan. I was much more focused on the learning objective rather than having multiple objectives and covering lots of knowledge and content. I was really clear that it was about game design, the principles of play, and then the behaviours of the teacher or the coach within that session. I also, under your advice from last time, I set up early and I designed the areas so that they don't need to be changed within the lesson, or if they did, only a few cones would need to be put down. So last time I was having to change the size of the pitches in the working area all the time, whereas this time I set up and kept that structure all the way throughout. I think I also had better use of the co-teacher, and that helped a lot, that we could structure the lesson between ourselves, share the workload, make smaller groups, and that was much more effective in one, sharing the knowledge that I wanted to get across, and two, helping the students deepen their understanding of game sense as a pedagogical tool.
That's great to hear. So it really sounds like you took on board the previous feedback and certainly inbuilt that, if you like, into your lesson planning, which seems to have paid huge dividends. So could you tell me what you found most rewarding through this process of obviously planning in more detail to make effective use of lesson time?
I think that it's helped me now with that focus, that although the focus of the lesson was, or the session was, on game sense, I think just being detailed, having less to cover, but doing it better, having multiple chances to come back to the key learning objectives in different ways, in large groups and smaller groups, and having the pupils or the students interact with each other in multiple ways is something that I can take into other lessons, other activity areas, and it just gives me a much clearer structure, I think, on my lessons and lesson planning. So that's something that I'm going to take and transfer into other areas as I progress.
That's great to hear. Certainly the structure, I think, was much improved, as you've highlighted yourself from the last lesson, and that's great to see you've taken that on board. So what did you find in this process that was most challenging for you?
One was with the planning of the working environment, and conceptualizing all the different ways that we might go from 12v12 to 6v6 to 3v3s and maybe individuals, and how the working environment could be kept to the same, and change very slightly or very quickly to respond to what was happening and what we were looking at and what the activity was focused. I found that really challenging, and that was even in an activity area like rugby, which I've got a lot of background knowledge. But I think I can then take that and use it in other, particularly other invasion games that I don't have a huge amount of subject knowledge, and potentially other games categories like striking and fielding games. But I found that a real challenge. But getting that right, I think, allowed everything else to flow better. I wasn't having to stop. Children or students weren't having to stop whilst I was spending minutes changing the working area.
Great. So you've obviously spent a lot of time there focusing on your timings. Do you think there's anything else you could identify to help you with? Anything else you could have thought of?
Yeah, so something that didn't work well was that of each of the micro teaching sessions that the students had planned and designed to run through, that it was too loose. The discussions at the end of it were wide ranging and weren't really getting to the point that of the lesson, of the learning objective.
So can I interrupt there? And
Yeah.
What did you actually tell the pupils then in that session, in their micro teaching session? Because you said the focus wasn't quite right. What did you ask them to think about?
I think I just asked really too broad and open-ended question about what was good about that.
So I think there then, you've highlighted yourself. I think what would potentially help you in certainly, with your timing and keep focused towards the lesson objective would be if you had more specific questions. So if they asked, specific questions that was linked to that objective, and I think that would help you in terms of getting better outcomes for that section, and also in terms of improving the timings. I think there's one other thing as well that potentially you might need to think about is how you can transition a little bit better from one activity to the next. So it might be helpful if you had one group that was, you went to and you set up and got them organised for the next activity, and if they were then actively participating in that activity and had a few minutes, if you like, a head start on everybody else, you could then stop the other groups and ask them to look at that group and see what they were doing next, and then they could simply very quickly move on to that activity rather than having to stop every group one at a time and then show them how to move on to that next activity. So you might want to consider that in terms of integrating that into your lesson next time. That would certainly help with timing.
Yeah, I think that would just everywhere else was just really clear, really focused, really on it, and then I don't think I'd planned that as well. And those two things that you've just suggested, of having not a big open-ended question but a focused question linked to the learning objective, and then thinking ahead and getting a group to set up and demo would definitely make that section of the lesson much tighter and allow me more time at the end to get a better debrief and to revisit the core task in more depth. And I think that didn't happen well because the micro teaching didn't happen well. So it's definitely something to take on board.
Yeah, it's all a learning process, and there'll always be these things to improve your teaching. So that's fine that we can identify a few things for you to take forward into the next lessons. So could you summarize for me here then what you're going to take away from this session that's focused on planning and teaching well-structured lessons?
Okay, I think one of the key areas now is planning for the areas that will allow transition from large group activities to small group activities without massive amounts of changing equipment or having to spend downtime in transition, because sometimes that's where some of the behavioural problems go. I think although I was better planning for the co-teacher. I think I need to give some specific advice for the co-teacher and some specific questions perhaps for the co-teacher to ask. I need to keep the main learning objective the main thing throughout. So even when I'm getting the students or the children to reflect or ask those questions, I need to make it clear to them what that is. That will improve the level of the feedback. And I need to be thinking about setting up the next thing in advance and whether I can get some of the students to take responsibility for that. So it's set, they can demo, and that speeds up the micro teaching elements of that session up. So clear structures all the way throughout, no matter what element I'm looking at, timings, clear questions, clear focus all the way through.
That's great. So you've clearly established the what, if you like. So so what next then? What do you think you need to focus on next?
I think compared to the last session, it's so much better. We covered so much more. The students got actual chance for them to implement the knowledge that I was providing them, whereas last time it was just me always talking. And although it was an engaging lesson, I think this one was better for their learning and their understanding. It just held off near the end, particularly with the micro teaching, and then the core task, and then questions arising from that core task was just rushed. So I quite like to stay on this target for another week.
Right.
And I know I've improved, but I just want another chance at hitting target 4, and particularly structuring my lesson so there's good understanding and knowledge throughout, and the transitions are really clear. And
so could you summarize that? Well, now what's going to be your next target, and what you're going to focus on in that next lesson? What's going to be the clear focus?
So still session target 4, but within the micro teaching sessions, clear focused questions, clear timings on how long those sessions and the feedback lasts for, and also having a clear structure of which group is going to set up for the next micro teaching, and get them to demonstrate it whilst I perhaps help with the verbal instructions of what needs to happen. And then hopefully that gives me more time to visit the core assessment task and check their understanding better. That's what my focus would be in the next lesson.
That's great. Thanks for that, Alex. Hopefully you've got those written down. I've certainly jotted them down if you need to come back to me to confirm those targets. And then, if you work on those for the next lesson, I'll certainly, when I observe, focus on those points, and then we can have our discussion following the teaching around that target. So again, thanks for letting me observe you today. Great effort and improvement, certainly with regards to the planning. That's paid huge dividends, and always areas to improve. And I'm sure, with a little bit more planning and focus on that next time, you'll get there. So great, thanks very much. So that ends the example of our feedback session, how it may follow with a student teacher. And you can see there, again, with these guidelines here giving feedback, you can see the student teacher. What we really want to get to a place is where the student teacher is really driving that feedback session, and the mentor is there to simply help and scaffold support when and if needed. So we hope the guidance here and the session there that we've just shown you, between a conversation between a mentor and student teacher, helps you in bringing this guidance to life. Thanks very much for listening.